Now, in what you will be delighted to hear is our last very short session before lunch. We will hear from Dr. Andrew Gibson, who's Assistant Professor of Education at Trinity College Dublin, and this is a short presentation on one of the funded research projects that Andrew will give to us before lunch.
So I'm here to surf the room's collective downward trajectory of blood sugar levels. So bear with me. We'll get through it at speed. What I'm going to present is a little bit of the research that we did on this idea of a survey of academic integrity. So that is the McCabe ICAI survey. I'll get into a little bit of detail on that. But just to give you a sense of the kind of approach we took, if we were to take the operative word here, it would probably be attitudes, plural. So that's what we were aiming at. We were aiming at eliciting as much difference and variety as we could when we were looking at the question of academic integrity in Irish higher education. So thanks to the team as well, Angeliki Lima, who is our postdoc researcher on it, Nina Singh, who's a PhD researcher on it, and my colleague John Walsh. So the focus of the project was to look at the ICAI-McCabe survey. One of the ideas that QQI was putting out there was to either run a pilot. It turns out Trinity was going to be running a pilot of the surveys anyway. So we ended up taking the other approach, which is looking at the variety of understandings that there might be relating to doing such a survey. And the aim was kind of broad. One aspect was to look at costs framed relatively narrowly. But then the other side of it was, what would it mean, full stop, to do this kind of survey in Irish higher education? So the McCabe ICAI surveys, now plural, the ICAI has been around for about 30 years. And it comes out of the research of Don McCabe, who was an academic integrity researcher. And they set up a survey to roll out to institutions, primarily in North America, looking at what ways do students understand or approach academic integrity. So that's the survey that's been out there for 30 years. Recently, they brought out a faculty survey, and faculty tells you that it is a quite North American approach to these things. So there's two goals to these surveys. On the one hand, it is to generate data for academic integrity researchers themselves, and then the other side, it's for institutions to get a sense of what's going on within their institution. So like some of the other lightning talks you saw earlier on, getting that kind of data. And these are just some of the issues that they're looking at within the two surveys. So the student survey, it's gathering things like demographics, motivation, moral judgment, and so on. The faculty survey, which is the newer survey, is trying to bring in a few extra aspects to it. So, overview of the project. Reasonably straightforward. We attempted to do an initial cost-benefit analysis looking at things relatively narrowly. Literature review, but just to note, because it's been just over 30 years since Don McCabe published his initial paper in 1992, there's a real wealth of literature out there of review papers that are looking at different issues related to academic integrity. So I can point you in the direction of looking at the literature review we did. There's really, really rich stuff there. As well as that, semi-structured interviews, and then some focus groups. So to borrow from Danny's point about a menu earlier on, we're so close to lunch, this is going to be a amuse-bouche. This is not going to be getting into the meat and vegetables of absolutely everything. So just in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, this is the question of what would it cost or what does it cost to implement? And that's reasonably straightforward. It's $650 to join ICAI, and that is the cost it takes to actually roll it out. So we were trying to find out by talking to previous users and looking within Trinity itself, what were the costs? Hard to pin down because it wasn't costed in that way. But what did come out of that conversation that we were having was, if this was to be given as a piece of work to an external consultant, in terms of billable hours, it could be quite unmanageably expensive. But if it's folded into general work that is being done in the area of academic integrity by academic integrity communities of practice within institutions or specific committees, that makes it more manageable. Challenges, one of the things that wasn't expected by McCabe ICAI themselves was getting ethical approval. That slowed down the implementation. So that was a bit of an issue. Also kind of new within Trinity, because previously doing student surveys, that hasn't been required, but the GDPRification of everything means much more care is being taken with these issues now. In terms of the impact, this is something that will come through repeatedly, which is even doing the survey was regarded by students and staff as being beneficial. It in itself was an act of sensitization. It in itself was an exercise in education about the issues surrounding academic integrity. Another impact that was quite useful was it brought the conversation around academic integrity away from vagueness, away from, well, I had a student who, or I heard from someone on their course. It was rooting the conversations in data, so people were able to say, well, actually, if we're talking about something like SA Mills, what does that look like? How many of our students are engaging with those kinds of contractors? The other important aspect of it was to give a grounding to the policies that are being developed within the institution, to be able to point to academic integrity resources that exist from things such as NAIN, from QQI, and being able to point to that and to show kind of the extent of the problem. And just in terms of what people who implement the surveys wish they knew before they did it, relationships are key to this kind of thing, as we've noted from some of the other projects that have been done. So many different moving parts within institutions are necessary to involve and engage in terms of doing these kinds of things. It's not as big of an undertaking as it appears, because the surveys have been in use for around 3 decades, some of them. That means they're relatively well honed, and ICAI as an organization is well practiced at what they do. Generating data is relatively easy. The next bit and the hard part is what you do with the data and how to take action. But there, at least, having data to rely on, having data to refer to, does make life a little bit easier. Focus groups, we did 2, and this was to look at how could the surveys be adapted. So this was getting into some of the nuts and bolts of what the actual text of these surveys looked like. The plan had been to do an academic-focused survey on academic staff. The opportunity presented itself to talk to some students, so we took that, free data. And in this, what we were aiming to look at, and this is a focus of the project and the report as a whole, is to bridge that gap between the people who are involved in generating policy and who are doing research in this space, and then other people within the institution whom this research affects. So we were interested in talking to people who aren't involved in academic integrity. And coding the transcripts, it was interesting because a lot of people would say, I'm sure there's an academic integrity policy. And it's like, there is an academic integrity policy, don't worry about that. But these are people who are not actively engaged in this space. Again, that educational dimension, that was coming through. For people to have a conversation about the text of the surveys, they found that really, really useful. They enjoyed that as a reflective piece, looking at their own practice, looking at how they design assessments and so on. One of the things that was emerging was the types of words that are being used within the survey, so I need to tailor that and how that relates to other things like the lexicon that's out there, or the words and terms that are being used in policies within schools. So some schools are still talking about plagiarism, they're still talking about cheating, but that's not the framing that you would see in other spots, so there was a bit of confusion around that. So ambiguity was another point here that was quite important, because how these surveys have been constructed in North America, they have certain words that they're quite comfortable with, so you'd expect that. That's something that's quite reasonable. But the one that came out in this space was in terms of collaboration. So when academics were talking about this and talking about what they do, certain activities and certain practices that are framed within policies as being forms of collaboration were regarded by academic colleagues and academic staff as, that's what we want them to do. We want students to be able to have conversations in this. So going back to the ambiguity point, one of the words that popped up earlier on was this notion of unauthorized use. And some of the academics in our conversation were saying, authorized by whom? It's my classroom, so where is this notion of authorization coming from? So not necessarily completely rejecting the framing that's existing out there in policies, but problematizing it. Definitely a amuse-bouche territory here in terms of the semi-structured interviews. These are just some of the headings that are in there in the report. I'll be putting the QR code up there. So that's what we were aiming to look at, eliciting different understandings of academic integrity that are out there among the participants in the interviews. And the other one I would also point to is this notion of alternatives to the survey. So that's what we were asking when we were interviewing participants. The question was, would you use these surveys? Would you find them useful? Would you like the data? Would this inform your practice? And from that, a follow-up question was, would you do something else? So everyone likes to poke holes in things. Well, what do you propose we do as an alternative or as a supplement? So I'd recommend that. In terms of some quick-fire conclusions, what was coming through across the board was surveys like this, they're fine, but not in isolation. So they need to be supplemented with something else. So just relying on these surveys to tell you about what's going on, that's not fantastic. And in there, some of the other methodologies we've seen discussed today are useful, but one of the nice ones was that came through was the notion of pedagogical workshops. So having workshops with students where you're discussing actually how you design assessments for them, that was found to be quite generative and quite beneficial by some of the people who we had interviewed. Another thing just to focus on, these were people who weren't necessarily all engaged in academic integrity and didn't know a huge amount about it or the policies. So some of them assumed it's going to be the cops and robbers type situation. So it is important, I think, in this space to continually maintain this focus that we have on these restorative dimensions, on these pedagogical aspects of bringing people into a space where they have the skills to not be subject to things like academic mispractice. The notion of cultural specificity to the Irish context, that came through, that's come through in a couple of other talks as well. And a little bit of alliteration to end off. We've talked a bit about leading and learning. The silent partner in this is probably listening. And academics were very, very happy to be able to articulate their view because they said on certain occasions, there was consultation, but I wasn't in the room, or I didn't get the email. So just reminding ourselves continually as researchers and as practitioners in this space to make sure that we are trying to bring in those voices. And that's the QR code for the report.